1990. 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Greene, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Greene threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor, but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed. Evening came. But the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them, and they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend, Kobe Laker, went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household, and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, The police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer. But when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that, not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime. Overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach. The story of Tim and Charlene's meeting resembled a romantic fairy tale. Two intelligent, attractive, and successful young individuals were ready for marriage and, upon meeting each other, immediately understood that their union was meant to be. Over the course of 3 years, they tied the knot, moved into their own home, and welcomed a little daughter into their lives. However, after the arrival of their child, money became tight for the family, so Tim and Charlene decided to sell their beloved pickup truck and buy a simpler car. In May 2013, Charlene posted an online ad, and now she nervously paced the room of her house. Tim had been gone for over an hour, and she was starting to panic. Even if the men had decided to take the car for a test drive, they had been gone for too long. Charlene called her husband multiple times, but all the calls went to voicemail. He hadn't responded to her messages. Although she knew for certain that Tim had charged his phone before leaving for work, when he still hadn't returned late into the night, Charlene called the police to report her husband's disappearance. The Hamilton police took the disappearance of the 32-year-old man very seriously. Canine search teams and search and rescue teams were deployed, not to mention the hundreds of Ancaster residents who joined in the search efforts. Despite the community's involvement in the search, many suspected that the man had simply run away, possibly due to a disillusioned life or accumulated debts. However, the detectives found no evidence to support these theories. The police organized a press conference where Charlene directly addressed the abductors, pleading for them to release Tim and emphasizing the need for their little daughter to have her father, and for her, a husband. Barely holding back tears, she added, "It was just a car, just a silly car." It was only when Charlene uttered those words that everyone realized, all at once, that the car was the very reason for the man's disappearance. And thus, anyone could become a victim simply because they decided to sell their pickup truck. 3 days later, Tim's phone was found. It was discovered by a worker in the grass near a construction site, approximately 20 minutes away from Hamilton. However, there was no sign of Tim or his pickup truck nearby. The discovery of the phone itself was not significant since the police had already obtained all the necessary information from the telecommunications company. Detectives started investigating the phone number from which potential buyers of the pickup truck had called Tim. It turned out that the phone was registered under a false name and address. But Tim was not the only one listed in the outgoing calls. The persistence of the criminal who had used the number multiple times led the police to Igor Tumenenko, an Israeli army veteran who was selling a similar Dodge Ram and had posted an advertisement online. Igor told investigators that he had taken a test drive with 2 men just 2 days before Tim's disappearance, but unlike Tim, Igor had returned home after the drive. Perhaps it was because Igor was a tall, robust former soldier who could resist attackers if necessary. But most importantly, Igor provided the investigators with a description of the men, mentioning that the tall guy had a small bag slung over his shoulder and a tattoo on his wrist that read ambition. During the subsequent press conference, the police shared the description of the 2 men with journalists, and within 2 days, colleagues from Toronto contacted them, claiming to know exactly who the Hamilton police were looking for. They identified the wanted man as a young millionaire, playboy, and one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, 27-year-old Dylan Millard. Long before the police took an interest in him, Dylan Millard was a young prodigy. At the age of 14, he made headlines as the youngest Canadian to pilot a helicopter and an airplane on the same day. Born in 1985 to Wayne and Madeline Millard, Dylan was the heir to the multi-million-dollar airline company Millard Air, founded by his grandfather. However, by the time he turned 20, the guy dropped out of university and led a rather idle lifestyle. Dylan threw poolside parties, drove the most luxurious cars, and was always surrounded by glamorous women. He allowed his friends to live in his numerous houses and apartments, and he moved so frequently that some of the household staff never even met him. 2 months before the events described, his father unexpectedly passed away, leaving Dylan as the inheritor of the family fortune. According to his friends' estimates, it ranged from $10 to $20 million. It was hard to believe that a millionaire with a garage full of luxurious cars would be capable of kidnapping someone over a pickup truck. The police put Dylan under surveillance and discovered that he was friends with an employee of the airline named Mark Smick. Unlike Dylan, Mark did not come from wealthy parents. In fact, he made a living by selling illicit substances. However, what was of greater importance to the police was the extensive list of criminal offenses associated with Mark. At the same time, by comparing the footage from several surveillance cameras, the investigators pieced together the events of that evening. Shortly after the pickup truck left Tim's house, A dark SUV can be seen closely following it in the video. Dylan was behind the wheel of one vehicle, while Mark was driving the other. It cannot be stated with certainty, but Tim was likely already dead. Half an hour later, the cars stopped, and the criminals changed the license plates of Tim's pickup truck to avoid police detection. Now that they had obtained the desired pickup, their next task was to get rid of its owner. At 2 a.m., they arrived at the Millard Air hangar. The pickup was towing a large trailer with some heavy equipment on it. Mark and Ellen entered the hangar, and soon sparks and flames started to emerge from the equipment on the trailer. This mysterious fire would burn throughout the night. Early in the morning, when Tim had been missing for 12 hours, Millard Air employees received a message from Dylan instructing them to stay away from the hangar. Arthur Jennings, an employee of Millard Air, recalls that the demand was explained to him as company policy. On Tuesday, he obediently avoided entering the hangar, but on Wednesday, he came across a pickup truck identical to the one described in the news. The man didn't know what to do. Deciding to photograph the vehicle and its identification number, he dialed the anonymous crime reporting hotline and requested it to be checked. They confirmed that it was the same vehicle. The man was so shocked that he felt physically ill. Fearing for himself and his family's lives, he only reported what he had learned on Friday. By that time, the pickup truck was no longer in the hangar. Fortunately, thanks to the phone data and Igor's testimony, the police already had a suspect. On May 11th, 4 days after Tim's disappearance, Dylan was arrested by the Hamilton police. Charlene was relieved, thinking that her husband would now be found quickly. She didn't know that the police no longer expected to find him alive. Acting on a tip from neighbors, officers arrived at Dylan's mother's house, where they discovered the pickup truck in a large trailer on the driveway. The pickup had been partially dismantled and meticulously cleaned, but despite that, they found Dylan's fingerprints and traces of blood inside. The keys to the pickup are still hanging on Dylan's keychain. But what about the equipment that the pickup was towing that night? The police searched all of Dylan's apartments and homes. On his farm, they found an industrial incinerator for burning various types of waste. This huge furnace was the very equipment from which sparks of flame were seen on the night of Tim's disappearance. Inside the furnace, forensic experts found small bone fragments, including human teeth. Due to the intensity of the fire, obtaining DNA was impossible. However, it is presumed that the bones belonged to Tim, and on May 14th, the police officially announced his death. Astounded by their findings, the investigators wondered if there could be other victims among Dylan's acquaintances. They continued to search Dylan's farm, but by that time the Toronto police had already missed 3 crucial clues, each of which could have saved Tim. The first was the mysterious disappearance of 23-year-old aspiring actress Laura Babcock. By the time arrests were made in connection with Tim's murder, Laura was already missing for about a year. She had met Dylan at a pub in Toronto. They dated for no more than a month, after which they remained friends, although romantic encounters still occurred. In 2010, Laura met Sean Lerner. Sean was a complete opposite of Dylan, and he was clearly in love with Laura. Although their relationship ended after 18 months, they remained friends. After graduating from college, Laura had difficulty getting her life together. She was depressed, had arguments with her parents over their house rules, and found herself practically homeless, staying with friends. To make ends meet, Laura turned to the escort industry. Upon learning about her friend's difficulties, Sean paid for a motel room where Laura could stay with her pet and provided her with an iPad to search for more conventional work. It was Sean Lerner who organized a party for Laura's 22nd birthday, inviting Dylan and his future girlfriend, Christina Nuga, among others. Clearly, it was this love triangle that led to the tragedy. Laura continued seeing Dylan behind Christina's back, but Christina likely suspected something, and on Laura's 23rd birthday, she sent her a message saying, "Happy birthday." It has been exactly a year since Dylan and I became intimate. Laura immediately retaliated, saying, "Great, and I was with him 2 weeks ago." This message genuinely upset Christina about her boyfriend's infidelity. Dylan had to assure her that he would deal with Laura, promising Christina, "First, I'll hurt her. Then I'll make her leave. I'll remove her from our lives." On July 3rd, 2012, Laura went home to her parents and left her dog, suitcase with belongings, and a shoebox containing approximately $1,000 in cash. She then went to the subway station, where Dylan picked her up and drove her to his home. At 7:03, Laura made a call to check her voicemail, and her phone connected to a tower near Dylan's home. After that, her phone stopped working completely. At 7:30, Dylan informed Mark that he was on a mission and would return in an hour. The next day, Laura's iPad was connected to Dylan's computer, and its name was changed to Mark's iPad. Afterward, Dylan took a picture of an object wrapped in blue tarp. In light of the events that unfolded, the photo speaks for itself. Dylan asked a worker from his aviation company to build a massive furnace for him, but when that experiment failed, he ordered a waste incinerator. On July 23rd, he sent a message to Mark stating that the barbecue was hot and ready for meat. Dylan's internet search history during that time revealed his interest in the effective temperature for cremation. Finally, he took a photo of Mark with the pipe from the incinerator and filmed the flames erupting from it. On July 14th, Laura's family and Sean Lerner reported her disappearance to the police, but upon learning about her recent mental state and profession, the officers didn't pursue her case, assuming she would return on her own. However, Sean refused to let the matter rest. He obtained a printout of Laura's recent calls and conducted his own investigation. It didn't take him long to discover that the last 8 calls from her phone were made to Dylan Millard. Sean called Dylan, who initially ignored the calls but eventually agreed to meet him and discuss the situation. Dylan claimed that Laura had asked him for illicit substances but didn't receive them. He then told Sean not to hope to see her again. Sean relayed all the information he had gathered to the police, presenting them with Dylan Millard's name on a silver platter. However, the detectives once again refused to take any action. Laura's case was forgotten, but a year later, when Sean heard about Dylan's arrest for murder, he quickly connected the dots and convinced Laura's family to call the Hamilton police. Unlike their counterparts in Toronto, the Hamilton officers showed great interest in their story. After the arrest of the men, Laura's iPad and her sports bag with her name and address written by her hand were found at Mark's house. In addition to incriminating photos on the iPad, investigators found a video in which Mark raps and essentially confesses to burning the girl's body and throwing her phone into the river.
Outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find the phone.
Laura was still considered missing in November 2012 when the Toronto police missed 2 crucial leads. They were of a slightly different nature, but equally important to the case. An online advertisement for a motorcycle appeared, and just a few days later, its owner, Marty McDougall, came home to find that both the motorcycle and its trailer were gone. He knew that there was a surveillance camera right across the road that could help identify the thieves. Marty contacted the police, and an officer came and took the camera footage. However, despite Marty's persistent attempts to reach the investigator, he heard nothing from the police. It wasn't until several months later, after Tim's murder, that the Hamilton police contacted Marty, having discovered the stripped motorcycle and trailer. Where were they? In Millard's aviation hangar. This raises the question of why the police didn't use the footage to track Millard months earlier and save Tim. The third crucial lead that the police missed was the sudden demise of Wayne Millard, Dylan's father. After speaking with family members and colleagues, the police discovered that Wayne had threatened to cut off the funding for his son's extravagant lifestyle. Delia was spending enormous sums of money and showed little interest in the family business. Wayne didn't want his son to destroy the fruits of his family's hard work and was planning to put an end to it, but he didn't get the chance. Wayne was found in his bedroom, deceased. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and a revolver was found nearby. Initially, the case seemed obvious to the police. However, now that the detectives knew about Delia, they wanted to re-examine the facts. At that time, he was not considered a suspect, although it's unclear why investigators didn't pay closer attention to his behavior. He appeared too calm, relaxed, and gave very strange answers to questions. However, when a relative passes away and someone needs to identify the body, if someone asked when was the last time they saw that person, nobody would answer, 5 minutes ago to the coroner. No, a person would recall the last time they saw their relative alive. The reason for this is that most people don't want to think about death. When answering such a question, the brain automatically goes back to a previous, more positive moment. But the problem with Delia is that the murder brought him pleasure, so when asked about the last time he saw Wayne, he immediately thought about the body. One more important detail, Wayne was cremated, but his hands were tested for gunshot residue and none was found. In combination with the odd behavior of the millionaire's son and the apparent financial benefit for the heir, it's strange that the police quickly closed the case. As for the family's friends and journalists, they were informed that the man died from a brain aneurysm. Since they didn't know the true cause of his death, no one suspected anything. Otherwise, they would likely have demanded a thorough investigation. When the detectives finally took up the case after Delia and Mark's arrest, it wasn't difficult for them to discover that the revolver from which the bullet was fired had been purchased by Delia prior to Laura Babcock's disappearance, and his DNA was found on it. Initially, Delia claimed that he stayed at Mark's house before returning home around 6 p.m. and finding his father. However, phone records showed that he was at home from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., precisely during Wayne's time of death. It's as if the accumulating evidence against the two was not enough. Delia secretly passed 65 letters to Christine from prison, instructing her on what statements she should give. He ordered her to destroy all the letters immediately after reading them, but she did not comply. During the trial, Delia and Mark almost confessed to the murder, shifting blame onto each other. However, in this case, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Both accomplices were found guilty of the murders of Tim and Laura and were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Delia received a similar punishment for his father's murder. The judge ruled that they would serve their sentences consecutively, meaning Delia would have to spend 75 years in prison before he could even be eligible for parole. This is the maximum sentence ever imposed in the history of Ontario. Delia's girlfriend, Christina Nuga, pleaded guilty to obstructing justice in relation to Tim's death. She revealed that she transported a car trailer and an incinerator to dispose of the evidence. The 24-year-old received a lenient punishment due to her testimony against Delia and spent 3 months in prison. She later moved to Poland, where she attended medical school. The remains of Laura and Tim were never identified, but it is highly likely that they were found in the incinerator. Delia Millard grew up in an affluent family and could have had everything he wanted. However, it turned out that what he wanted was to become a criminal. Just 2 years after meeting Mark, they started going on what they called night missions, stealing cars and motorcycles, not for profit, but for the thrill of it. They often burned them on the side of the road or destroyed them in an aircraft hangar. Once considered one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, he officially transformed into a serial killer, accused of murdering his father, former girlfriend, and an unknown person in less than a year. But if Laura and his father stood in Delia's way, we will probably never know why he killed Tim. Whether out of boredom, audacity, or growing confidence that he could get away with anything, even murder. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu văd nimic.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sequestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheamă Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Masishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gerga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day.
He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Gheorghe started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Gheorghe returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Gheorghe say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Malencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Malencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Luisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Luisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Luisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Luisa's grandfather, assuring him that Luisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Luisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the 4th day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Luisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Luisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Mașișanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the 2 murders came to light, The criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the 2 murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Louisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon.
He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Luisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Luisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Georga's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Georga most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Georga was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Georga was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Georga once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened. Larry Riskin joined the Navy after school, and over the years of service, he achieved the rank of commanding officer in the Navy fleet. He participated in the Persian Gulf War and demonstrated courage and bravery multiple times, but unexpectedly discovered that he was taking orders from a fragile woman. Larry met Sonia Rios at a barbecue. She owned a beauty salon in the city of Lomita, a suburb of Los Angeles. He was immediately attracted to the very beautiful and striking woman, and within a year, Sonia took her husband's family name and became Sonia Riskin. They settled in Sonia's house. Larry was always extremely close to his family, parents, brothers, and especially his younger sister Sherry Jackson. But everything changed with the arrival of Sonia. She did not allow him to see his relatives, inventing various reasons why they couldn't visit them in Washington. The relationship deteriorated to the point that Larry didn't communicate with his sister and brothers for over 10 years. They only heard rumors that he had resigned and found a job as a teacher for children with special needs. His colleagues remember that he loved children and adored his job. However, he confessed that he was unhappy at home. One thing weighed heavily on him. He dreamed of becoming a father. However, Sonia did not want to have children, and being a very beautiful woman, she misled Larry, pretending to be younger than him. In reality, she was 16 years older. Of course, women at that age are still capable of having children, but Larry felt that his chances of fulfilling his dream were diminishing with each passing day. That's why he grasped at the last straw. In Sonia's homeland, the Philippines, he became attached to his wife's brother's grandchildren, Quincy and Jetmark. The parents of the teenagers believed that with Sonia and Larry in the USA, their children would have a better future, so they supported Larry's proposal to adopt them. Sonia did not object, but insisted on taking care of all the legal matters herself. A year passed, 2, 3, but the process of adoption was not progressing. Larry discovered that Sonia was intentionally sabotaging the adoption process. At that moment, it was his last chance to create a complete family, and he was very disappointed. So much so that he demanded a divorce. Sonia agreed, but with one condition. She asked her husband to go to the Philippines and sell her family business, a taxi company, a matter that needed to be resolved immediately. The man agreed, partly because he wanted to see the children, especially since Quincy's 16th birthday was approaching. Surprisingly, Sonia did not go, even though the matter concerned her family and her business. Before his visit to the Philippines, the first in 13 years, Larry visited his relatives in Washington. He was happy to start a new chapter in his life without his wife but with her nephews, whom he still hoped to adopt. Immediately after landing, Larry went to see them. During the birthday party, Larry noticed that the little cousin of the boys had developed an eye infection. He insisted on taking her to the hospital. Someone present made a call to Sonia and informed her that they would be at the hospital. Larry put the girl in the car and, along with Jetmark and a few other adults, they all went to the hospital. After the visit to the doctor, they got back into the jeep and were about to return home when a motorcycle approached them. One of the two men on the motorcycle started shooting at Larry's head and abdomen. Then the criminals quickly fled the scene. Jetmark tried to help Larry and called for help. He was confident that they would save him since the hospital was only a few steps away. But the boy was mistaken. They couldn't save Larry. He was 43 years old. When Sonia was informed of her husband's murder, she completely lost control. She was shaking all over and needed help from neighbors Nicole and Jim Thompson to calm her down. Nicole called Larry's sister, Sherry, to inform her about what had happened, but unexpectedly, Sherry started blaming Sonia for everything. Nicole and Jim didn't take her words seriously. Not then. However, the next morning, Sonia asked Jim again to come and help her search for documents. When Jim learned that Sonia was looking for her husband's insurance policy, he refused to help her. While Larry's family was preparing for his funeral, his wife was only interested in the insurance. Moreover, Sonia had no intention of attending the funeral. She arranged for her husband to be cremated, and the urn with his ashes remained in the Philippines with one of her relatives. Larry's relatives saw this as another blow from Sonia, but they still held the funeral and prepared a niche in the mausoleum, where they hoped to someday place the urn with his ashes. They hoped that the Philippine police would solve this case, confident that Larry's wife was behind it all. But at that time, they still didn't know, nor could they have known, that there was another mystery in this story, another man, and another murder. It was news that had the impact of a bomb exploding. Larry Riskin was not Sonia's first husband, and the reason why they were no longer together with her first husband was that he was killed in the Philippines 19 years ago. The man's name was Earl John Bordeaux. Earl's family lived in Davenport, Iowa, in the same house where he grew up. He was the pride of the family. Earl joined the Navy during the Vietnam War, but his unit was stationed in the Philippines, where he met an attractive local girl named Sonia, who sang at a nightclub near their base. It was obviously love at first sight because the young couple quickly got married, and a few months later, Earl brought his young wife home to meet his family. However, the happy reunion did not go well. The girl did not please Earl's family. Therefore, after his departure from the Navy, they settled in Southern California. Several years later, Sonia opened a beauty salon, and her husband found work in a bakery. Outwardly, it seemed like a family filled with love and harmony. But in reality, Sonia enjoyed giving orders to her military husband and controlled him as she pleased. They lived together for more than 20 years when Earl finally realized that such a family life and his wife's commands were burdening him. Sonia agreed to divorce. But before that, and here a strange sense of déjà vu arose, the husband needed to go to the Philippines to sell the family taxi motor company. Earl didn't want to go, but his wife was inflexible on this issue, and the man chose not to argue. He pleaded with his younger brother Dennis to go with him, but he couldn't quickly obtain a passport, so Earl went to the Philippines alone. It was a hot August night when Earl's plane landed in Manila. He arrived at the house where his wife's relatives lived around midnight. The man was exhausted from the journey, fell onto the couch, and fell into a deep sleep until he was truly killed. When the police arrived, they found Earl lying in a pool of his own blood. He had been shot. The officers concluded that a robber had entered the house and Earl had interfered, but there were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, and the criminal only fired at Earl. 3 men were immediately arrested and charged with the murder. Later, 2 more were detained. They were all members of Sonia's family. Fresh human blood was found on the shirt and pants of one of Sonia's brothers. There was enough evidence to send the culprits to prison for a long time. But then came a surprise. Since Sonia was the closest relative, according to Philippine law, she was supposed to attend a preliminary hearing in court where charges would be brought against her family members. However, since she didn't show up, the charges were dropped and the case was closed. The local authorities claimed their hands were tied, at least officially. Unofficially, the locals gossip that Sonia paid to make all the problems go away. As they explain it, $1,000, and the witnesses would stay silent and the evidence would disappear. Earl's brother, Dennis, felt guilty because he let his brother go alone, so he constantly called a lawyer in the Philippines, spending thousands of dollars on his own investigation, hoping to make Sonia worried. But instead, he became the target himself. He received around 200 threats over the phone, but he didn't calm down. He reported Sonia to the police and the FBI. As a result, he became the target of the killer. It happened once while he was fishing. The shooter missed, but it didn't end there. Later, the attack happened right near his garage. Dennis informed the FBI about everything, but nothing happened. The Bordeaux case was forgotten until, after 10 years, Dennis learned that Sonia had a second husband, and he suffered the same fate as his brother. Dennis hoped that the renewed interest in Sonia could also revive interest in his brother's case. Once learning Sonia's plans to obtain not only all the property but also her husband's insurance, things didn't go as planned. The insurance company hired a private investigator who quickly discovered that fraud was nothing new for Sonia. She had burned down her beauty salon for insurance purposes, manipulated taxes and receipts. She had been caught twice before, so her name was known to the police. The investigator provided his report to the employer, and the insurance company refused to pay Sonia the insurance money. However, the investigator's work impressed Sherry and her family so much that they hired him to investigate the murders. He quickly found out that Earl's and Larry's murders were similar in that the Sony brothers were involved in both crimes. They, like other family members, were financially dependent on Sonia and were willing to do anything she demanded. Sherry, just like Dennis, handed everything the private investigator found to the FBI, hoping that an investigation would finally begin. However, weeks and months passed and nothing changed. Sonia continued working at her salon as usual. But after the new year, Sherry started receiving emails. The author claimed that Sonia was responsible for Larry's murder and offered to return his sister's ashes. The emails were signed by John Bordeaux. How could that be? Bordeaux was the surname of Sonia's first husband, but Earl John Bordeaux had long been dead. It turns out that Sonia had a son whose existence she kept secret. She gave birth to a boy in the Philippines when she was a very young girl, a teenager. Earl adopted the boy after their wedding. Earl's family knew nothing about him, nor did Larry's family, despite Larry's desperate desire to have children. Nevertheless, Sherry decided to respond to the emails, primarily because she wanted to return Larry's ashes. John asked for $35,000 in return, but the more they corresponded, the more Sherry became afraid of what kind of person he might be. What if he was a fraud or something worse? With each new letter, she realized that he was indeed worse. For an additional fee, he offered another service to kill Sonia, whom Sherry despised. Sherry was frightened, not knowing how to escape this situation and fearing what else might happen. Her fears were not unfounded. On April 27, 2007, in Lamita, the 60-year-old owner of a beauty salon was found murdered. She had been shot, and the killing resembled an execution rather than a random shooting. The victim was Sonia Riskin, known as the Black Widow of Lamita, who was suspected of killing not one, but two husbands. She met the same fate as her victims. The arriving police were struck by the meticulous and well-kept nature of the house. It appeared that the owner rarely received visitors during her lifetime, which perfectly matched her character as a reclusive and suspicious woman. It was also interesting to note that there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed that the killer simply entered the house and shot his victim. Her purse remained untouched, along with the cash inside. The neighbors saw nothing. The victim's relatives immediately rushed to the scene, among them her beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Sonia regarded him as her favorite grandson and was proud of him. The young man served on the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier and had just returned home after a tour of Asia. Upon hearing that his beloved aunt had been killed, he immediately informed the police that if something happened to Sonia, John Bordeaux was responsible for it all. John Bordeaux didn't have to be searched for, as he was the one who found Sonia's body and contacted the rescue service. The detectives immediately found the relationship between the son and Mother Strange. There wasn't a single photograph of him in the house, no hint of a son, as if he didn't exist for Sonia. Overall, he seemed like the family outcast, especially compared to Sonia's favorite, Eric. John explained that although he and his mother sometimes couldn't find common ground and didn't communicate, the situation had improved recently, and he would never harm her. When asked who he believed could have committed the murder, he could only mention Sherry, Larry's sister. After all, she genuinely hated Sonia, as did Dennis. The FBI questioned both of them, but they had alibis. Moreover, no one was as devastated by Sonia's death as these two. They hoped Sonia would pay for her terrible actions by going to prison, so the detectives turned their attention back to John. The electronic emails signed with his name didn't work in his favor. Furthermore, he failed the polygraph test. Even his own relatives considered him the murderer. Allegedly, no one else had the motive, opportunity, and means to commit the crime, but he insisted on his innocence and stood his ground. Therefore, the detectives didn't rush to arrest him, and they were rewarded with a clue from the Black Widow herself. A few days before Sonia's death, she contacted the police to report two strange incidents at her beauty salon. The first time, a young man appeared at her hairdressing salon wanting a haircut. He called her from the parking lot, and Sonia saw him through the window. She became suspicious because he had a short, military-style haircut. It was clear he didn't need a haircut, so she told him that she only served regular clients, which he wasn't. It seemed like the incident was resolved, but 2 days later, the same guy returned to the salon and this time acted more aggressively. He opened fire on Sonia, causing her to panic and call the police. She informed the officers that she didn't know the shooter, but she remembered he had called her 2 days ago. The cautious woman recorded his number. It belonged to a certain Fernando Romero. Romero himself had disappeared, but the detectives only needed a warrant to access the history of his calls. They expected the phone to lead them to John Bordeaux, but no, his number wasn't listed. Instead, they found the number of someone they knew well. A person who had communicated with Fernando not once or twice, but frequently, especially in the hours before and after the murder. The number belonged to Sonia's beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Further on, after a week, the news reached the FBI. Specialists were investigating the IP addresses from which the supposed letters from John Bordeaux were sent. All of them led to Asia, Hong Kong, Korea. These addresses belonged to naval bases. The FBI employees knew that Eric and Romero were two sailors who served on an aircraft carrier. It was likely that they knew each other. Could these young individuals have planned the murder while being on an American military ship? The FBI investigated the location of the ship during the time the emails were sent. It was in ports in Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea at the same time the letters were sent. However, sending letters is one thing, but why would Eric kill a woman who cared for him better than his own son? Sonia was killed late in the evening on Friday. And on Monday morning, even before the office opened, Eric was already waiting for her lawyer. He wanted to know how much money he would inherit from his beloved aunt. However, Sonia had another card hidden up her sleeve. Eric didn't receive a cent. All her money, homes, cars, Absolutely all of Sonia's belongings were left to her son, Jean Bordeaux. But the young man had another harsh blow awaiting him. It turned out that all this time, while he believed he was the main suspect of the police, Jean Bordeaux was being misled. And when the investigators simply presented him with a photograph of Fernando Romero, Eric lost his ability to speak. Choking on surprise and stumbling over his words, he blurted out that he had conducted his own investigation and Fernando had nothing to do with it. He must have realized that Fernando was the thread leading the investigation back to himself. Both young individuals were arrested and charged with the murder of Sonia Riskin. The police apologized to John for pressuring him. He was still frightened after what he had to endure, but he understood that the detectives were just doing their job. In February 2011, the trial began. Fernando and Eric were tried together. The prosecution faced a difficult task. The victim of the murder herself was suspected of orchestrating the killings of two husbands. The accused, the young sailors, could elicit sympathy and comparison. The prosecutor decided to be honest with the jury. He portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer deserving punishment, but now it was necessary to punish the defendants who not only killed a woman but also attempted to frame her son. It worked. The jury found the two guilty. They were sentenced to imprisonment ranging from 26 years to life. It was an astonishing family. They eliminated anyone in their path of financial gain. Sonia and her brothers killed Earl. Sonia and her brothers killed Larry. And Eric killed his beloved aunt. How many murders can there be in one family if it's not a Game of Thrones? The irony lies in the fact that Sonia killed two people who did nothing wrong and were always kind to her. Eric killed a person who had always been kind to him for the sake of money he never received. The Black Widow of Lamata truly reaped what she sowed. In 2019, Sherry went to the Philippines to personally try to find Larry's remains. She could only ascertain that the remains were passed from one relative to another under Eric's orders. In the end, her search led her to a house that had obviously been vacant for a long time. She couldn't fulfill her dream of returning with her brother's urn to their homeland.
Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not one, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Piccaccio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Trisha had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Trisha Piccaccio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Trisha and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Trisha's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Trisha's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock.
The police immediately began an investigation. Trisha had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Trisha's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Trisha's brother, Doug Piccaccio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Piccaccio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Trisha a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Piccaccio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Trisha's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Trisha's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner. And later, he bought Trisha's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Trisha's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Trisha. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Trisha's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Piccaccio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Trisha's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Trisha's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Piccaccio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer, but when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft, and it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten. But by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children aged 4 and 5, and one set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Trisha Pacaccio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Trisha's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Trisha's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Trisha's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Trisha's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Trisha was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Trisha's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Trisha's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Trisha's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Boccaccio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Boccaccio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims. On November 6, 1994, Jan Balmain stands on the platform of Newcastle Railway Station, Australia. She cranes her neck, trying to catch sight of the approaching train. Jan eagerly awaits the arrival of her 22-year-old daughter, Revel, who boarded the train to Sydney. The journey takes just 2 hours. A mother waits, anticipating her daughter, an extraordinarily beautiful blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, to flutter onto the platform and embrace her. Revel Balmain lives in the prestigious Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill, not far from the city center. She is a model and a dancer. She had planned to visit her parents before a work trip to Japan, where her troupe awaited her for their 4th tour. But there is much that Jan doesn't know about her daughter, and on this November day, Revel does not disembark in Newcastle. Traces of her short life are scattered across Sydney's streets, including items intended to accompany her to Japan, a journey she will never make. 22-year-old Revel Balmain was close to realizing her dream. As a professional dancer, she had already visited Japan on 3 concert tours and eagerly anticipated her 4th trip. She supplemented her income by modeling, appearing in magazine spreads and product advertisements. Just a few days later, a new issue of a popular Australian magazine featuring Revel on the cover was scheduled for release, an esteemed accomplishment for a model. Additionally, 4 weeks ago, Revel met a promising 27-year-old director named Piers Fisher Pollard. Young, beautiful, and talented, Revel had high expectations for life, and it seemed like her entire life lay ahead of her. Revel started dancing at the age of 3. She adored music, jazz, and tap dancing. During her teenage years, she spent a year in a theater school in Britain. However, upon returning from her first concert tour, she realized that performing on stage was her true calling. Unfortunately, it didn't pay as well as she'd hoped, so she juggled dancing with modeling jobs. But even that wasn't enough to cover her bills. Therefore, she decided to improve her financial situation by offering her services to an escort agency. Many girls work in this field for a very short time, facing difficulties, and she was one of them. Much later, Revel's mother would state that her daughter's decision shocked her family. She had grown up in a loving family, always supportive of their children, and if financial troubles arose, she could have turned to them. The woman speculated that the deeply hidden reason for this decision might have been related to an incident when Revel was 4 years old and found her 1.5-year-old brother Matthew floating in the pool. He couldn't be saved, and it was very difficult for her parents to recover from this. Perhaps Revel never managed to overcome it. Nevertheless, in November 1994, Revel's boyfriend, family, and most of her friends had no idea about her side job. Saturday, November 5th, 1994, was supposed to be her last day working in escort services. At some point, her life took a turn, but after 6 weeks of leading a double life, she was returning to her true love and passion, dance. The day before, she had lunch with her friend Kate Brentnall, who described her as happier than she had ever been. She was very excited about her trip to Japan. Revel had dyed her hair to a softer, more natural blonde. I thought it was symbolic. I thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sadly, that journey would never take place, because the next evening she disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. Revel spent Saturday morning with Piers. In the short time they had been dating, they had become inseparable. However, suddenly Piers developed an intense headache, forcing them to go to the hospital. After seeing the doctor, Revel suggested having lunch, but Piers declined due to his migraine. Around noon, he escorted her to a bus stop. Revel headed to the city center while Piers preferred to lie down. At that time, Revel was working for 2 different escort agencies. One of them was managed by Jane Stanojevic and Zoran Stanojevic. As her boyfriend, Piers, couldn't spend time with her, Revel called Jane and Zoran's escort agency to inform them that she was available. The administrator replied that she had a 2-hour booking from 4 p.m. It was for a new client, a young man named Gavin Samer, who lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called Kingsford. Later at 10 p.m., she had another appointment with friends of Zoran from Serbia. Zoran was eager to please his friends and suggested having her accompany them to the hotel because he wanted to offer them the most beautiful girl. Revel arrived at Gavin Samer's house with a bottle of champagne as requested by Gavin. She was wearing cork wedge shoes, a long skirt, and a tunic. She had a pager. During that time, there were no mobile phones, so escort agencies handed pagers to the girls, sending them messages as new orders came in. At 3:50 p.m., Revel used Gavin's phone to call the administrator and let them know she had arrived. This was a way for the girl to signal that she felt comfortable at the client's house and that everything was fine. 2 hours later, at 5:50 p.m., she called the administrator again and said the meeting was over and she was leaving, but there was no need to send a driver for her. However, as Gavin later revealed, she didn't leave, but instead arranged to spend an extra hour with him for additional payment. This was a risky practice because the owners of the escort agencies did not approve and sometimes punished the girls for such side jobs, naturally because they didn't receive their share of the profit. While she was with Gavin, her boyfriend Piers messaged her, feeling much better. She told him she lay down to rest. Piers easily believed this as he had no suspicion about her side job. At 7 p.m., she received a message on her pager from her friend Kate Brittle. 15 minutes later, Revel called back and let her friend know she couldn't talk, but would call from home in an hour after changing, and then they would have a couple of beers together at the Royal Hotel, a popular pub in Sydney. Afterward, she planned to meet Pierce. The sun set that day at 7:25 p.m. according to Gavin. That was the last time he saw Revel when he dropped her off at the nearest pub, the Tomato Inn. He pulled up to the pub, she got out of the car, said goodbye, and entered through the back door. Gavin then went to a store for cigarettes and cider before heading home, watching TV, and going to bed. At 7:53 p.m., Revel's boyfriend Pierce sent her another message on her pager, but she didn't reply. By this time, Pierce had met their mutual friend Zoe. They were visiting different bars in the city, and Pierce constantly messaged Revel on her pager so she'd know where to find them. The last time he attempted to contact her was at 2:30 a.m. Then he went home to sleep. She didn't respond to any of his messages. On the following day, November 6th, Revel's mother, Jen Belmain, stood on the railway platform in Newcastle, awaiting the arrival of the train from Sydney, on which her daughter was supposed to arrive. Revel's parents were eagerly anticipating their daughter's arrival to have a sort of farewell celebratory dinner, to catch up, chat, share the latest news before she was due to embark on a 2-week rehearsal in Brisbane, followed by her troupe's upcoming 4-month tour in Japan. The train arrived, but Revel wasn't on it. Jen assumed that her daughter might have missed the early morning train and waited for the next one. However, Revel still didn't appear. As time passed, Jen realized that something was amiss. She returned home and immediately made phone calls. She contacted her daughter's friend, the apartment neighbor, and hospitals in Sydney, trying to ascertain her whereabouts. When Revel's apartment neighbor informed Jen that Revel's room still had an almost fully packed suitcase with her belongings, passport, and ticket to Japan, Jen realized it was time to involve the police. Jen, along with Revel's apartment neighbor and her boyfriend Pierce, reported Revel missing. However, the police were not swift in commencing an investigation, despite the discovery of Revel's belongings scattered throughout the Kingsford area, where her last client, Gavin Seymour, resided. Her bag, cosmetics, diary, credit cards, and keys to the Bellevue Hill apartment were found strewn across different streets. One of her high heels was found in a trash bin, while the other was discovered in a nearby block. The plastic casing of her pager was lying in a gutter. On the 5th day after the girl's disappearance, when everything indicated an unfortunate event involving Revel, the police started their investigation. Initially, they explored the version that Revel was abducted on the streets of Kingsford, with the abductor throwing her belongings out of the car window while driving. Wild rumors circulated, suggesting she might have been abducted at the request of an Arabian prince and taken to Saudi Arabia. However, the police attempted to investigate more realistic scenarios. Pierce was the first to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have learned about the girl's double life and became so furious that he killed Revel. However, when informed about her side jobs, it was a double blow for the young man. He had an alibi for the evening of her disappearance, and apart from her family, a few friends, and her roommate, he was one of the few people who insisted on continuing the investigation, demanding a more serious approach to the case. Next in line as a suspect was Gavin. Several suspicious moments arose in his story. He recounted that on that Saturday, when he decided to engage the services of the escort agency, his girlfriend Michelle had left home to visit her family. He hired Revel and paid her $500 for 3 hours. To pay Revel, he pawned Michelle's clarinet and received $250 for it. Additionally, he won $150 at slot machines in the Tomato Inn pub. This summed up to $400. He paid this in cash and another $100 to Revel by check. However, the pub staff couldn't recall cashing out his winnings, and he allegedly lost his family's checkbook. Even in the store where he bought cigarettes and cider, there were no records corresponding to the man's claims. His girlfriend Michelle was, of course, questioned. She flew from Brisbane to Sydney 2 days after Revel's disappearance. Gavin met her at the airport, and she immediately noticed scratches on Gavin's chest and neck. There was also a mark on his finger, as if from a bite. The police also noticed these wounds, but Gavin couldn't explain where they came from, whether from surfing activities or gardening. Michelle also pointed out that Gavin cleaned his car and folded the rear seats, although she added that he often turned the car into a mess, then cleaned it to accommodate his surfboard. Additionally, her incredibly lazy boyfriend laundered the bedding and hung it out to dry just before her arrival. She found it suspicious, but it likely indicated his attempt to hide infidelity rather than criminal activity. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't even conclusively prove that a crime had occurred. The Revel parents were determined to seek justice for their daughter, but no one was arrested or charged with anything. A member of the Revel family claimed that the police considered Revel's life less valuable because she was promiscuous, hence they half-heartedly conducted the investigation. Gavin's house was searched not immediately after the girl's disappearance, and even then, it was done without a warrant. It was more of a cursory inspection. Gavin's car was checked for DNA and other evidence only after 10 days. Many crucial witnesses were not interviewed and evidence was not gathered. Naturally, the investigation stalled, and there were no developments in it for several years. Only in 1999, after an active campaign by the public, media, and the girl's relatives, did interest in the case resurface, and it was reviewed by the coroner. The detective who led the initial investigation told the coroner that, in the police's opinion, Gavin was the prime suspect in the case. Even Gavin's lawyer, Seymour, was forced to agree that his client was the sole suspect. Gavin worked for the girl's parents' company and at the time was an attractive, successful young man. Additionally, he was quite athletic as he loved surfing. Gavin lived with his girlfriend, Michelle, but when she went to visit her family, he decided to hire an escort. Gavin was the last person seen with Revel. According to him, she spent an additional hour with him before he dropped her off at the Red Tomato Inn, a pub in Kingsford. He parked his car in the back. Revel exited the car, said goodbye, and walked inside through the back door. He then went to a store and headed home. However, nobody at the pub who was present at that time could recall seeing Revel. The owner explicitly stated that they had a different crowd that evening, and if such a girl had entered the pub, everyone would have noticed. Despite Gavin purchasing cider at the store, no one remembered this. In other words, after Revel's last call to her friend from Gavin's house at 7:15 p.m., nothing from Gavin's account was officially confirmed. Moreover, Michelle, now his ex-girlfriend, told the coroner in 1999 that she called Gavin that evening but got no answer. After several attempts, she finally got through at 9:22 p.m. and he sounded agitated. His other ex-girlfriend, who had been involved with him before, stated that after drinking, he could become aggressive and hit her in the face. This raised suspicions further, especially because Gavin had been drinking on Saturday throughout the day and had at least consumed half a bottle of champagne brought by Revel. However, one witness, a young man named Jeremy Coughlin, offered a completely different scenario of what might have happened to Revel. Jeremy was a friend of one of Revel's wealthiest clients, Mark Colton. Jeremy recounted that he and Mark were at a party when, after a few drinks, Mark abruptly said, "Aren't people stupid? Have you heard about Revel Belmain? First, there were rumors about an Arab prince who took her to Saudi Arabia. Nonsense. She's at a depth of 3 meters and nobody will find her body. That's what you get for deceiving the brothel you work for. The brothel owner wanted her dead because she was damaging his business." Jeremy asked his friend about Mark's relationship with Revel, and he replied that he met her outside the brothel, paying her between $500 to $1,000 a week, which was cheaper than paying the agency $200 per hour. When Mark Colton was questioned, he denied saying anything like that, but he indeed had heard rumors that agencies were threatening employees who saw clients privately. Owners of the agency were also questioned. It turned out that on Revel's last day working at the escort agency, she owed Jane and Zoran money, around $300. However, as explained by Jane, this wasn't considered unusual. While most clients pay with credit cards, some prefer cash, and at the end of each week, the girls in the agency reconcile who owes what to whom. According to Jane, Revel was planning to repay the money owing to a meeting with Zoran's friends scheduled for 10 p.m. However, Zoran claimed he was unaware of such an agreement. In fact, his words contradicted those of his wife on almost every point. Jane described that on the day the girl disappeared, she and Zoran bought a television, had pizza at a pizzeria around 5 p.m., and went home. She didn't work that night because she was heavily pregnant and tired. However, Zoran told the police he didn't work on the evening of the girl's disappearance, literally saying, "No, not on Saturday." He claimed he took the TV to the office, installed it, and returned home around 7 p.m. Yet, 4 years later, during the coroner's inquest, he stated that by saying, "No, not on Saturday," he meant not during the day on Saturday. In reality, he did work that evening and returned home around 2 a.m. He blamed the misunderstanding on the translator. However, later,
a linguistic expert confirmed that the original statements of the man were translated correctly. Regardless, Zoran claimed he did not see Revel that night.
As the agency's driver, he picked up another girl, Kelly, at 7:15 p.m. He took her to meet his friends at Royal Hotel Park in Darling Harbor, where he waited for 2 hours before driving her to another appointment at the Sheraton Airport Hotel. When he was taking the girl home, he had a flat tire, which he had to fix himself. For 4 years following the girl's disappearance and before the case was considered by the coroner, the police did not interview either Zoran's Serbian friends, who had long since left for Belgrade, or Kelly, Revel's colleague, who provided Zoran's alibi. Partly this was because when Jane Stanojevic gave her initial statement in 1994, she said that Revel was supposed to meet the Serbians at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. After 4 years, she claimed she had made a mistake and actually meant the Park Royal Hotel in Darling Harbor. It wasn't until 1999 that the police checked the registration records of both hotels, finding no information about the Serbians in either. Only after Zoran's testimony did the police locate Kelly, who reluctantly corroborated his words. However, when the police checked the Sheraton Hotel records, they couldn't find evidence of Kelly or her client being there. Gavin Seymour, the lawyer, was puzzled as to why the girl was miraculously found only now, why she wasn't questioned 4 years ago, and why the police didn't investigate inconsistencies between Zoran's and his wife's statements, which couldn't even agree on whether he was working on November 5th, 1994. In response to all these questions, the chief investigator who led the initial investigation said that he didn't know. The Revel family was deeply upset by what they heard during the coroner's inquest. The police failed to interview many crucial witnesses, and other witnesses, of course, had long forgotten what they had seen over such a period of time. Their lawyers stated that the girl's parents were treated as a nuisance, despite their only desire being to know what happened to their daughter. Didn't they deserve that? Even the coroner was forced to agree that the initial investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. After examining the case, the coroner dismissed the theory that Revel staged her own disappearance because there was no evidence to support it. After all, if she wanted to disappear, the timing was extremely inconvenient. She was already planning an extended trip to Japan and would have returned to pursue her career as a model and dancer with renewed vigor, making her short stint as a call girl forgettable. Additionally, her personal life seemed perfect. She and Piers were crazy about each other, and there was nothing indicating that she wanted to run away. On May 28, 1999, the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered on November 5, 1994, by an unknown person or persons. He noted that there wasn't sufficient evidence against the police's main suspect, Gavin Seymour. However, if his name had been hidden from the public eye until then, now everyone knew who was considered the prime suspect in the case. Before the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered, the police had no body or evidence to work with. It was only in 2008 that detectives from the cold case unit sent forensic experts to Gavin's house, due to advancements in technology. Subsequently, detectives went to Tasmania to question Gavin, but he refused to provide DNA. Gavin, once a successful young man, moved to Tasmania and worked as a chef due to being essentially accused without trial of Revel's murder. He led a very secluded life, drank heavily, and hardly interacted with locals. After spending 15 years there, he returned to Sydney in 2018. He only spoke to a journalist once, explaining that the case had cost him job opportunities and felt as though he was punished without being proven guilty. He knew people considered him guilty, but he claimed innocence. In reality, he was more preoccupied with how the case affected him than Revel and her loved ones. However, he stated he didn't kill Revel. He was only guilty of hiring a call girl that day. Revel's parents passed away without receiving answers about their daughter. What happened to her? Who killed her and why? Her sister still hopes the case will progress. Over the years, she searched for her sister's body. Now, she seeks answers. She needs to know who killed Revel. It seems her prayers were answered because in 2021, a new phase of the investigation began. The police announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to Revel's killer's arrest. Additionally, Jane King, former owner of the escort agency and Zoran's ex-wife, made an incredible statement. She said she never thought Gavin Seymour could be involved in Revel's disappearance. However, she now had new evidence supporting Gavin's truth, evidence that would help clear his name but was not found by the police conducting the initial investigation. Essentially, his whereabouts that evening were confirmed. That's all she could disclose at the moment. This new information turned the investigation upside down. In fact, a series of new facts were discovered in the case, crucial enough to be presented to the coroner in February next year. Yes, it took almost 30 years, but the police identified clear contradictions that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. While old evidence still needs testing with new technologies, the new investigation is focused on Jane's ex-husband Zoran and his constantly changing story. He was one of the main drivers for the company, transporting girls to clients. However, there were always discrepancies in the statements he gave to the police. During the initial interrogation, 10 days after Revel's disappearance, he claimed he wasn't working that night, but was at home with his wife. In 1999, he admitted to being at work, but his new version of events still didn't align because the evidence crucial to his alibi was not found. Revel was supposed to meet Zoran's Serbian friends at 10 p.m., but for some reason, the police never questioned them. Incredibly, in 2021, an anonymous call was made to an organization called Crime Stoppers regarding this man, in the photo, who could be involved in the crime. This likely refers to Bojan Prevalovic, Zoran's friend and Revel's last presumed client. While Jane King never met her husband's friend, she now knows that Zoran arranged something for him the day after the girl's disappearance. He bought a ticket from Australia to Thailand. Essentially, the man Revel was supposed to meet that evening left the country the very next day after her disappearance, and no one bothered to inquire about the reason for such haste or coincidence. In December 2021, a raid was conducted on Zoran's property, revealing cannabis worth $400,000 and exclusive items valued at $150,000. He faced 36 charges and was denied bail. Most importantly, according to the police, the raids were carried out based on information obtained during the new investigation into Revel Belmane's disappearance and presumed murder. A detective explicitly stated they were investigating Zoran's involvement in the crime. However, if Zoran's behavior appears unusual, no less suspicious are the actions of Jane King herself. On the day Revel disappeared, she and Zoran had lunch at a pizza place. The next morning, upon learning that Revel wasn't answering calls or messages, Jane immediately dialed the pizza place's number. A staff member recalls her being in a panic, as if it were crucial for her to secure an alibi. She allegedly said to the staff member, "The police are investigating a murder. Can you confirm that we were at your restaurant?" Jane denies phrasing it this way. She insists she said disappearance. But regardless of whether she said murder or disappearance, why was she in such a hurry to confirm her alibi on the very day Revel, a grown 22-year-old woman, had disappeared just a few hours ago? Where did this rush come from? Why was she so certain that Revel simply missed her last evening order, given that such occurrences had been noted before? Jane King herself hadn't even called the police at that point. Likely, nobody had yet contacted the police, and certainly, nobody was conducting an investigation. It seems she was certain that she would be asked where she was that day. One can't help but suspect that Jane and Zoran know more than they want to reveal. At the very least, people who definitely knew where Revel was that evening, apart from her last client, were the escort agency administrator, Jane King, and Zoran Stanovic. The new police investigation leading to the second coroner's inquest, planned for early next year, is in defiance of the apparent difficulties posed by the time elapsed since Revel Belmane's disappearance. However, it currently promises the greatest hope that this dreadful case will be solved. Today, detectives are closer than ever to capturing her killer. In 2016, a suburban train was moving along its usual route towards Berlin when suddenly one of the passengers felt unwell. Unfortunately, it was not possible to save him, and the 37-year-old man passed away due to heart failure. Despite the sorrowful nature of his death, he died of natural causes. However, his departure from life triggered a chain of events that led to the resolution of a case that had remained a mystery for 23 years. The German town of Bad Belzig, which was simply known as Belzig until 2010, is located 70 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Today, it is home to 11,000 people. Bad Belzig is considered a historic town because it houses the medieval fortress of Eisenhart Castle, Burg Eisenhart, first mentioned in a document from the year 997, issued by Emperor Otto III, which is quite impressive. Apart from the castle, one of the main attractions of the town is the thermal complex called Steintherm, where families and groups of friends often gather on weekends for leisure and relaxation. Overall, Bad Belzig appears to be an excellent town for family living. Among the families who settled in the town was the family of Andrea Lohagen. Andrea, her sister, as well as their parents Rosemarie and Freddie, lived on the outskirts of the city in a new residential complex. Andrea was born on January 6, 1977, and by 1993 had grown into an attractive 16-year-old girl. Andrea was in the 11th grade and eagerly awaited finishing school. As one of the top students in her class, she felt confident about her future studies at the university. She was a responsible, intelligent, serious, well-read girl, yet sociable and friendly. Everyone who knew her sincerely loved her. On Thursday, October 7, 1993, there were only 2 school days left before the holidays. Naturally, Andrea was looking forward to the upcoming vacation, shopping, parties, and meetings with friends. On that day, her parents decided to spoil their daughter and took her to a large shopping center where they bought Andrea a pair of platform shoes and Levi's jeans she had been eyeing for a while. At 6 o'clock in the evening, when they returned home, Andrea, as usual, turned on the music cassette of her favorite band, Alphaville, and began selecting what to wear with her new items. Of course, she was in high spirits. Indeed, like any teenager, she couldn't wait to show off her new outfit to her friends that same evening. And Andrea knew the ideal place to reach as large an audience as possible for this. After dinner, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Andrea called her friend to arrange a walk, but she was already in Potsdam. Pogo was the name of the local club where teenagers like to gather. As it often happens with clubs in small towns, it was conveniently located equidistant from the homes of local families, and Andrea and her friends were regular visitors. Pogo was a 15-minute walk from her home, and considering the short distance, the girl often walked instead of waiting for the bus. She hadn't learned to drive a car yet. Moreover, in a small town, she felt safe walking alone in the evening, and her parents were not afraid to let her go out alone. Besides, in the evening, the likelihood of not meeting anyone on the way was higher than encountering someone unfriendly. So, on October 7th, as always, Andrea decided to walk, first asking her parents for permission to leave for a few hours. They agreed, asking her to return no later than 10 o'clock. Andrea agreed without argument and left home at 8 o'clock in the evening. That evening, as always when their daughter left home, her parents stayed awake, expecting Andrea. But when the clock struck 10 in the evening, the girl hadn't returned home. At first, the parents thought she was caught up socializing with friends and either forgot about the time or didn't manage to leave the club on time. They waited a little longer, constantly peeking out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of their daughter. An hour passed, then a second, but it grew later, and Rosemarie and Freddie became increasingly worried. What troubled them particularly was that Andrea was one of the best students in her class, which meant she knew she had to go to school the next day. Therefore, it seemed unlikely for her to intentionally stay out late. It was completely out of character for her because she was a very responsible girl who always came home on time and listened to her parents. Complicating matters was the fact that in 1993, teenagers didn't have mobile phones. Andrea couldn't write or call her parents if she was delayed, and they couldn't find out her whereabouts. By 12:30, unable to contain their worry, the parents began calling her friends, hoping that perhaps she stayed the night at one of their places, as they were closer. But of course, that wasn't the case. No one knew where she was. At 1 o'clock in the morning, driven mad by worry, her father Freddie decided to look for her himself. He drove several times along the road she should have taken to the club, went through other, more remote streets, but he couldn't find his daughter. Shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, he went to the police station and reported his daughter missing. He probably hoped that the police would act immediately because several hours had passed since she was supposed to return home, but he was mistaken. Officers believed it was too early to take any action. Although this was extremely upsetting and disappointing for the girl's parents, those were the rules. The police often receive reports of missing persons, especially when it involves a teenager, and they prefer to wait a day before taking action because teenagers usually return on their own the next morning. On the other hand, how many reports of missing teenagers could the police get in the town of 11,000 people? Besides, Andrea wasn't a problematic teenager. She had no reason to run away. No conflicts at home or with friends. Andrea was a happy girl who had just returned from shopping. The holidays were near, and she was allowed to hang out and enjoy her youth with friends. Her parents were convinced that Andrea wouldn't have run away, but the fact remained. For Rosemarie and Freddie, this must have been a real nightmare. Sitting at home, unable to rest, fearing for their daughter's life, constantly imagining scenarios of what might have happened to her, knowing that nobody was even looking for her. On the following day, January 8th, Andrea's mother, Rosemarie, also attempted to search for her daughter independently. It's understandable that waiting for the police to take action might have been a real torment. She walked through the town center and along the path Andrea was supposed to take. About 100 meters from the Pogo Club, she noticed a wooded area. Interestingly, this plot belonged to the grandfather of Andrea's former boyfriend, a boy a little older than her, from whom she had parted ways just a few weeks before her disappearance. While exploring this area, the girl's mother stumbled upon a hut where she found a mattress and a hand towel lying around. At that moment, surrounded by trees and hearing only the barking of dogs, she suddenly felt very uncomfortable, almost physically sensing that something was amiss. Suspicion crept into her mind that Andrea's former boyfriend might have something to do with her disappearance, and she would continue to believe this for a long time. Convinced that detectives should inspect this area, she reported it to the police, but once again, they did nothing. They explained that they didn't see any reason or concrete evidence to investigate this territory. It was unclear where the evidence could have come from if they hadn't started their work yet. Perhaps they should have looked for clues in the hut. Nevertheless, they clarified to Rosemarie that they didn't have a warrant, meaning they couldn't legally go there. Only a week after the teenager's disappearance did the police finally begin their work. Law enforcement checked hospitals and transportation, leaving Bag Belzig, the place where Andrea could have departed from. Helicopters flew over the forests of the town for several days, while ground search teams, including dog handlers, scoured the area. Dog handlers searched the route between the girl's home and Pogo and examined the surrounding areas. To precisely establish Andrea's last actions, detectives interviewed all possible witnesses, everyone present at Pogo on that evening. However, it proved quite challenging, as the police had waited for an entire week and teenagers frequented Pogo every day. They were now confused about the specific day and couldn't accurately confirm if they had seen Andrea at the club on October 7th. Fortunately, after speaking with 21-year-old Yvonne Eshkin, a club employee, they were able to confirm that Andrea was there on the 7th. Yvonne remembered seeing Andrea standing outside the club. While she couldn't recall the exact time, it was definitely before 10 p.m. because Pogo closes at 10 p.m., other witnesses remembered seeing Andrea walking along a dark road towards the club. Another witness reported seeing her talking to two boys. The police questioned 13-year-old Robin and 14-year-old David, who confirmed exchanging a few words with Andrea as she was returning from the club, after which she went home while the boys went in the opposite direction. The police began to suspect that Andrea might have taken an isolated narrow path that would have been plunged into complete darkness at that late hour. The locals referred to this path as the Lover's Path, located between the homes of two families, which would have allowed the girl to reach home much faster than the main road. However, the police could never confirm whether she indeed took the Lover's Path because neither the canine units nor the forensic experts found any evidence supporting this theory. Nonetheless, this secret path was often used by teenagers returning from the club. To attract more attention to the case, Andrea's photo was shown on television, and a reward of 10,000 marks was offered for information that could help find her. The police asked anyone who could assist them in bringing the girl back home safely to contact them. They received over 250 reports stating that Andrea Lohagen had been seen in various countries around the world: Turkey, Greece, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Spain. However, despite the police's efforts to investigate each lead, none of them led to any breakthroughs. Eventually, the police admitted defeat as they had nothing to work with, and the investigation came to a standstill. The case remained unsolved, and Andrea Lohagen was no longer sought after by anyone other than her family. 7 years later, on July 9th, 2000, a local resident was enjoying her morning coffee on a beautiful day when she saw Josie, her landlord's dog, joyfully playing with something resembling a soccer ball. However, upon closer inspection, the woman realized that it wasn't a ball but a human skull. She hurriedly called the police. Soon, Frank Friedrich, the woman's landlord, arrived. Unexpectedly, he claimed that he had already seen the skull, took it from the dog, and hid it before leaving to celebrate his parents' birthday. Upon returning home to address the matter, The police were already there. The man explained his peculiar behavior by stating that he knew that during World War II, prisoners of war were held in that area, so he assumed the skull was quite old. Therefore, he hid it, intending to deal with it later. When the police inspected the area where the skull, presumably that of Andrea, was found by the dog, it turned out to be the very same location warned about by Andrea's mother, just 10 meters behind the lover's path and 100 meters from Pogo. Inside a long-abandoned cabin, behind a weathered door simply leaning against the wall, the police found the rest of the skeleton. Thus, if the killer attempted to hide the body, they hadn't put in much effort. Surprisingly, despite the police searching this location with sniffer dogs in 1993, nobody noticed or smelled anything. Journalists, reporters, the landlord's dogs, construction workers, and local residents had visited the site, all departing with the same outcome. Naturally, the locals, convinced the remains belonged to Andrea, were furious at how the police handled the investigation. The police defended their actions, stating they had investigated the area only a week after the girl's disappearance. Supposedly, they had acted very promptly since the police are obligated to search for a missing person, only if there are suspicions of a crime or several weeks after the disappearance. Regardless, the remains were sent to a laboratory, confirming they indeed belonged to Andrea. DNA comparison was unnecessary as the victim's dental records matched the teeth in the skull. Although the girl's remains were found, the forensic expert couldn't determine how she was killed or what happened before her death, as only the skeleton remained. However, he noted a head injury on the skull. Notably, Andrea was found not where the murder occurred. Her clothing wasn't found in the cabin. Even her watch and favorite ring were missing. To this day, it remains unknown whether this implies the victim was assaulted, causing her clothes to be removed, or if they were taken to conceal evidence.
If the latter is true, the perpetrator's actions seem senseless because the body wasn't even hidden. With the discovery of the remains, the case was reopened, but it was now a murder investigation for Andrea Lohagen. At this point, both the police and the townspeople questioned what the motive for the murder could have been. They were especially troubled by the fact that the lover's path, near where the body was found, was only known to a limited number of locals, suggesting the killer lived in Bad Belzig and possibly was still among them. However, despite this breakthrough and a reward of 5,000 euros for any information, the police still lacked substantial leads, leaving the case unsolved for many years. Everything changed in the summer of 2016 when an unknown woman called the police, claiming she precisely knew who killed Andrea Lohagen, her friend, 37-year-old David. He was one of the two boys who had met Andrea on her way from Pogo. At the time of Andrea's disappearance, David was 14 years old. As an adult, David was a loner who enjoyed solitude, struggled to hold a job due to alcohol and substance abuse issues, and this lifestyle undoubtedly led to health problems. The woman who called the police explained that the reason she decided to share this information was that David had died in the same year, 2016. He was on a train to Berlin when he suddenly fell ill and passed away due to natural causes. It is unknown how long this woman had been holding on to this information. David left no other confessions. The only evidence hinting at his guilty conscience was a dark post on a social media platform. In the photo, a man wearing a shirt with the inscription "Wanted" is seen holding a small child. Underneath the image, he wrote, "You can do the right thing 1,000 times, but make one mistake, and you're worthless." The police tried to learn from David's mother what she knew about the matter, perhaps if her son had confessed to her about the crime. However, she was reluctant to speak with the officers. After all, she still lived in the same town where Andrea went missing, and where her family resided. Eventually, she admitted that her son had told her they and a friend had planned to rob Andrea, but everything went wrong, and Andrea was killed. That was all she knew. The woman who called the police added that at the time of David's murder, he wasn't alone. He was with his then 13-year-old friend, Robin. In 2016, 36-year-old Robin lived in Tyrol, Austria, with his wife and 2 children, worked on a dairy farm, was very quiet, friendly, and spent evenings at home. He was so secretive that his colleagues only learned about his wedding after he decided to change his surname following the marriage. Robin was questioned on October 27, 2016, but since he was 13 years old at the time of the crime, he was questioned only as a witness, not a suspect. Law enforcement couldn't imprison him. Even if he confessed to the crime,
as he was below the age of criminal responsibility at 13.
Of course, this doesn't seem right. If you understand how to take someone's life, you should be punished in some way. During the conversation, Robin didn't deny David's involvement in the crime, but asked for the opportunity to discuss his own participation after speaking with his family. He was allowed to go home and was given a new date to return to the station for further questioning. However,
Police soon realized that Robin's desire to talk to his family wasn't the real reason for refusing to speak with them. It was merely an excuse to leave the station. Indeed, just a few hours after returning home, he left again. But before that, he left a farewell note for his wife. He put on hiking boots, got into the car, and headed towards Pendling Mountain, located approximately 15 kilometers from his home. There, he climbed the mountain and jumped from it. 4 days later, on November 4th, his body was found by a hunter. In the note to his wife, he didn't explain anything, just bid farewell. The police chief later mentioned that when the detectives spoke with Robin, they explained to him that he wouldn't face any problems, no prison sentence. They just wanted to know why he did it. They wanted Andrea's parents to get answers to the questions that had tormented them for so many years. But Robin decided otherwise. It was undoubtedly difficult for Andrea's parents to come to terms with his departure. With his departure, their last chance to find out the motive behind the murder disappeared. What happened just before Andrea's death and how exactly she died. Why they removed her clothes and how long the girl remained alive. Also, where exactly everything happened. However, it's very interesting that the plot where the cabin was located belonged not only to Andrea's former boyfriend, but also to one of the boys' grandfathers. This is because Andrea's ex-boyfriend and Robin were cousins. David and Robin were troublesome teenagers well known throughout the town. They were often seen smoking or drinking alcohol. Soon they embarked on a series of burglaries, after which they served time in juvenile detention. So, it couldn't be said that they were kids whom no one could suspect of anything. But murder is something much more significant than breaking into someone's house and stealing valuable items. Detectives spoke with the boys soon after they, as later revealed, killed Andrea. At that time, they were not suspected of anything. They were just witnesses. But one can't help but wonder, if you're 13 or 14 years old and you've just committed murder, how composed will you be when the police come questioning you? The detective who interacted with them in 1993 recalls that they were calm and rational. However, they asked various strange questions, like what it's like to be in juvenile detention as a murderer. Additionally, when the detective went to one of the boys' homes, he saw a cassette with inappropriate films on the table. Moreover, when he asked each of the boys to clarify where they met Andrea and which road they took afterward, their statements differed. Nevertheless, the oddities in the boys' behavior and the discrepancies in their statements were not sufficient to accuse them of anything. Certainly, there are many cases where investigators did not hesitate to pressure teenagers and interrogate them for hours on end in pursuit of a confession, but not in this case. Perhaps the police didn't want to interrogate and pressure David and Robin for long, considering their age. Although the police officially closed the case, Andrea's parents are not convinced. They suspect that a third person was involved in the murder. Freddie, the girl's father, couldn't believe that two young boys committed such a heinous crime without the help, guidance, or at least the influence of an adult or someone older than them. Rosemary and Freddie are convinced that they had assistance. Andrea's mother's intuition has proven right before. What if her intuition isn't wrong this time? It was a completely senseless and cruel murder. And even before the killer's death, they did not alleviate the suffering of the victim's parents. Shortly before Andrea's death, she wrote an essay titled The Tale of Happiness. Andrea narrated an encounter with an old man who told her, "I worry about you because you seem so sad." He promised to grant her 3 wishes. The first was a journey at 16, and the second was a happy future. Andrea, being prudent, didn't want to waste the third wish, explaining, "Who knows what will come after, as I am already happy." However pitiful an existence the killers might lead, even if they remembered the crime they committed every day, they could move on. But for Andrea, who loved life so much, hers was taken away. For 17 years, even the youngest residents of the French commune of Germain couldn't truly enjoy life due to the pervasive fear that gripped their families. Local resident Manon lives near the former home of the grieving family, and her parents told her about what happened when she was still a child. "We walk the same streets, so, of course, we are afraid that someone might attack or abduct us. the girl says. My father always accompanied me, and now we finally know what he did, and he confessed to everything. That is somewhat comforting. For 17 whole years, it was impossible to see a child walking alone on the street. On January 9, 2003, 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin disappeared while returning home from school in her hometown of Germain, in the department of Seine-et-Marne near Paris. The girl lived with her mother Suzanne Mouzin, who was in the process of divorcing her husband and Estelle's father, Eric Mouzin. The father lived in the commune of Le Vessinet with her older brother Arthur, approximately 60 kilometers away from her mother's home. When Suzanne returned home from work at 7:30 p.m. and realized that her daughter was not there, she reported the child's disappearance to the police. In July 2003, the police began to suspect that serial killer Michel Fourniret might be involved in Estelle's disappearance because he had confessed to killing 7 people, including 3 young girls. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier appeared to be ordinary French retirees, he with his glasses and well-groomed hands in a professorial pose, and she, with her sunken cheeks, resembled a typical grandmother looking after her grandchildren. Behind this facade, however, lay one of France's most dangerous sexual predators, who committed his murders with the active involvement of his wife and faithful accomplice. This grey-haired couple stood alongside the most horrifying criminals in the country's history. Using her image as a happily married, respectable wife, Olivier instilled confidence in the girls that they had nothing to fear, while the poor victims were about to become the next prey of the killers. Once the girls were kidnapped, bound, and sometimes drugged, Olivier would inspect them, checking whether they were virgins, which her husband desired. The couple met after Fourniret was arrested in 1984 for sexual crimes in the Paris area and placed an advertisement in a newspaper seeking a pen pal. Michel and Monique corresponded for a long time, and then, as it turned out, Fourniret proposed to Olivier, a former caregiver, to get rid of her 2 ex-husbands who, according to Monique, had mistreated her. In exchange, she promised to find young girls for him. Fourniret never fulfilled his promise, but 2 months after his release in 1987, Olivier did what she called her first offering to her beast. Isabelle Laville was a shy 17-year-old girl who was seeing a therapist. Olivier said she chose her because she reminded her of her young self but was still an innocent girl that her husband desired. Olivier drove up to Isabelle in her car and asked for directions, convincing the girl to get in the car and show her the way. A little further down the road, Fourniret was waiting for them, pretending to be a motorist who needed help because his car broke down. Olivier stopped and allowed the man to get in. As they continued on their way, Fourniret, sitting in the back seat, strangled the girl and announced that she was now their captive. On the way back to their home, they drugged Isabelle too much. At home, Fourniret found himself unable to assault the girl, so he had sex with Monique instead, and then he killed Isabelle by strangling her. In 2006, he led the police to her remains, which were dumped in an old well. Olivier claimed she didn't know that Fourniret would kill the girl. Whatever the case, the incident seemed to solidify the relationship between the couple. In 1988, while pregnant, Olivier asked 20-year-old student Fabienne Leroy for help, saying she urgently needed to see a doctor. The sympathetic girl got into the car, and this time, Fourniret was behind the wheel. He drove the car into a field and forced the victim to get out at gunpoint. After Olivier checked the girl's virginity, Fourniret assaulted and killed Fabienne. Her body was found in a field the next day, and the couple continued to find victims and kill them following their established pattern. When their son Salem was born, the criminals didn't hesitate to use him as bait, telling girls they needed a doctor for the baby. Even if Olivier didn't always accompany her husband on his trips, he would always tell her about his exploits, claiming that he went hunting or saying, "I found satisfaction." In 2003, Fourniret made a mistake. A 13-year-old girl he abducted in Belgium managed to escape from his van when he stopped at a gas station. She chewed through the rope he used to tie her wrists. The girl was picked up by a passing motorist who noted down the van's license plate number. Fourniret was arrested, and in his car they found several hairs, one of which belonged to Manania Thumpong, a 13-year-old girl whose remains were found in a forest in 2001. Fourniret was not eager to cooperate with the investigation, but the police from at least 5 countries, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, began reviewing cases of violence, abductions, and murders that remained unsolved and resembled Fourniret's crimes. In Denmark, the police noticed that the composite sketch of a suspect in a violent crime closely resembled Fourniret, while in the Netherlands, Fourniret started to be suspected in the disappearance of 2 girls. In 2004, the criminal finally confessed to kidnapping and killing victims during the 1980s and 1990s, admitting to abducting 9 girls and young women during that time. He is also suspected of 10 more murders, 9 in France and 1 in Belgium. In 2006, rumors circulated that Fourniret might be the true culprit in the case of Christian Ranucci. Christian, a 20-year-old man, was beheaded by the guillotine in France on July 28, 1976, after being suspected of killing 8-year-old Marie Dolores Rambler. This case had always been highly controversial. On June 3, 1974, Marie Dolores and her brother Jean met a young man driving a car, wearing a red sweater, who claimed he was looking for his lost dog. The man had asked the children to help him, and Jean ran to search for the dog, while Marie Dolores got into the man's car and was abducted. An hour after the girl's disappearance, Christian's car, a grey Peugeot 304, was involved in an accident and left the scene. Witnesses described the driver's appearance to the police, who immediately concluded a connection between the abduction and the fleeing motorist. After a search, Marie Dolores' body was found in the bushes, where she had been strangled to death. Ranucci was arrested due to the car accident and the fact that he was allegedly carrying a heavy package. Police found trousers with dried bloodstains in his car, and the blood group on the trousers matched the girl's blood group. At first, Ranucci confessed to the murder and told the police where he had hidden the knife in the bushes. What was strange about this confession was that he only confessed to facts that the police had already established in the first 48 hours of the investigation. A day later, Ranucci denied his involvement in the crime. Allegedly, Ranucci's case was adjusted and physical evidence was hidden to match his confession. The bloodstains on the trousers turned out to be much older and were merely the result of the man falling off a motorcycle. Moreover, Ranucci had the same blood group as the girl. An elderly couple who witnessed the incident claimed to have seen the girl on the backseat of Ranucci's car and heard her screaming. However, the credibility of this statement is questionable since the couple did not leave their own car, and the door of Ranucci's car was broken from the side opposite to where the pensioners claimed he had taken the girl out. Later, 5 more people claimed to have witnessed the abduction, and all of them described a man who looked nothing like Ranucci. 2 interesting points are worth noting. Firstly, Fourniret also drove a grey Peugeot 304, which from behind resembled a Simca 1100, a car described by 2 witnesses as the one the driver used to lure children inside on the day of Marie Dolores' abduction. The driver was wearing a red sweater, which was later found by investigators. As it turned out, the sweater found at the crime scene did not belong to Ranucci, as several sizes too small for an athletic-looking young man like him. Secondly, the most surprising discovery was a photograph taken by a photographer from a Marseille newspaper in March 1976 in the courtroom during Ranucci's trial. Among the visitors, there sat a man with glasses who suspiciously resembled Fourniret. Although the fact that Fourniret attended the trial was refuted, it is hard to deny that he is a much more suitable suspect in this case. For example, he went on vacation to Marseille in June 1974. Driving a car of the same grey colour and brand. At that time, he was 32 years old and, compared to Ranucci, already had a history of sexual crimes. Fourniret also frequently used the lost dog trick to lure young girls into his car. Additionally, no signs of violence were found on the child's body. Unfortunately for Ranucci, The media frenzy around the girl's murder made him a suspect even before the case went to trial. Immediately after his arrest, the press labeled him as the killer, and he was sentenced to death, becoming one of the last people executed in France. Why did the police begin to suspect that Michel Fourniret might be connected to the disappearance of Estelle Mouzin? 2 weeks before Estelle's disappearance, a 9-year-old girl was almost kidnapped by a man in a white van. The girl was able to describe the driver to the police, which led to the creation of a composite sketch of the suspect. When the police focused their efforts on Fourniret, who also drove a white van, they showed the girl a photo of him, hoping she would recognize him, but she didn't. Additionally, after his confession to the murders, Fourniret led the police to the burial site of one of his young victims. On the way there, he described the clothing the girl was wearing on the day of her abduction, which was similar to what Estelle was wearing on the day she disappeared, although the police believe this might be a mere coincidence. Sometime later, the police found photos of Estelle and recordings of television programs about the girl in Fourniret's house and on his computer. It's worth noting that 2 fragments of white shoelaces and black gloves were found with Fourniret, and Estelle was wearing white shoes and black gloves on the day of her disappearance. However, the police couldn't find any additional connections between the serial killer and the crime, and the hypothesis of Fourniret's involvement had to be discarded due to a lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. He claimed he made a phone call to his son from his home on the day the girl disappeared. Although there was no certainty that Fourniret actually made that call, the police believed he was not lying. Psychologists were also confident that Fourniret was not involved in the case because Estelle was too young for him. The 3 girls he confessed to murdering were 12 and 13 years old. His accomplice and wife, Monique Olivier, told the police that once when they were watching a TV program accusing Fourniret of killing Estelle, he laughed and said it wasn't him. In May 2010, the Mouzin family's lawyer requested a new investigation into Fourniret's involvement. In 2013, he was declared innocent after several hair analyses from his van, conducted when he was arrested in 2003, did not match Estelle's DNA. As for the second suspect in Estelle Mouzin's kidnapping, Nordal Lelandaise, the police were interested in him in connection with 3 different crimes. He was the main suspect in the murder of Arthur Noyer, a soldier who disappeared in April and whose skull was found in September. He was also the main suspect in the case of the disappearance of Maellys do Araujo, a 9-year-old girl who was kidnapped from a wedding on August 27, 2017. 9-year-old Maellys do Araujo was last seen on the night of August 27, 2017, at a wedding to which she was invited with her parents. At the event, the children were playing separately from the adult celebration. Around 3 a.m., her absence was noticed, and her search began initially without police involvement. A witness at the wedding recalled, the DJ of the evening announced over the microphone that a child was missing. Suddenly everyone started searching in the main hall and outside. It was terrible. To witness the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl, it's very serious. At first, we thought she fell asleep somewhere after playing hide and seek. An hour later, when she wasn't found, the police were called. The arriving police initiated the search for the child using search dogs and also explored the area with helicopters. All 180 guests invited to the wedding were interviewed. Almost immediately, investigators noticed inconsistencies in the statements of Nordal Lelandaise, a friend of the groom. A week into the investigation, after crime scene analysts found DNA belonging to the girl on the dashboard of Lelandaise's car, he was charged with her kidnapping. From that moment, Lelandaise remained silent, refusing to assist the investigation, and claimed that even though the girl might have been in his car, it didn't prove his guilt. As the police conducted their investigation into the child's disappearance, they discovered other clues pointing to Lelandaise's involvement. In particular, a surveillance camera captured a car belonging to the man leaving the wedding venue with a small figure on the passenger seat shortly before the girl's disappearance was reported. The blurry silhouette was wearing a white dress, similar to what Maellys was wearing. The parents recognized elements of the dress especially the child's ribbon, said their lawyer, Fabian Rajon. Additionally, Leland Day's phone was in airplane mode around the time of the girl's disappearance, and it turned back on 39 minutes later when he returned to the celebration alone. It was also established that the next day, Leland Days spent several hours cleaning his car with powerful cleaning products. He claimed he did it to prepare the car for sale. Leland Day's defense initially disputed the timeline provided by the prosecution. His lawyer confirmed that while traces of the girl's DNA were found on his car's dashboard, his client completely denied kidnapping her. He stated that several DNA traces were found on the dashboard, and someone who had contact with the child could have transferred her DNA into the car. He also speculated that children could have gotten into the car without the driver's knowledge, noting that the windows were opened during the celebration. After 6 months of investigation, Leland Days was forced to change his statements when Maellys' blood was found in the trunk of his car. He confessed to killing the girl and apologized to her parents. Earlier, he had admitted that she was in his car on the night of her disappearance but claimed not to know anything about her subsequent fate. Now, he admitted that he unintentionally killed the child. The prosecutor from Grenoble, Jean-Yves Coquelet, stated that Leland Days led investigators to the location near his parents' home in Domessine, Savoie Department, where the body was found. The search for the remains of the young girl took an entire day and was complicated by snow and rough terrain. Some of the girl's remains were found by the investigators and search dogs. The prosecutor from Grenoble said that Maellys' parents are no longer in the dark, adding that they know their daughter is dead, that she was killed, and that a few minutes ago they were told that the child's remains were found. This is a horrific conclusion to the case, the culmination of 6 months of investigation and search, he added. The girl's mother addressed Leland Days through a Facebook message. We had to wait 5.5 months for this monster to finally speak. Maellys will haunt you day and night in your cell, she wrote, grieving. My little angel, I couldn't protect you from this predator, and I will blame myself for that for a long time. Nordal Leland Days, a former military dog handler who was also charged with the murder of a young soldier, claims that he killed Maellys de Araujo by mistake but refused to provide details of what happened. Post-mortem examination showed that the girl had a broken jaw, likely from a strong blow to the face. The prosecutors handling Maellys' case suspect Leland Days to be a serial killer. On December 21, 2017, he was charged with the murder of Arthur Noyer, a 23-year-old soldier who disappeared without a trace during a hike on April 12, 2017. The soldier's relatives admitted that they also hoped to learn the truth about his death. Arthur was last seen early in the morning on April 12, 2017, as he left a nightclub to go on a hike in Chambéry. Pieces of his skull were found on a hiking trail in the municipality of Montmelian, near Chambéry, in September. The phone company recorded Leland Days' phone in the same area at the time of the soldier's disappearance. Leland Days' Audi A3 was also spotted by surveillance cameras in the Chambéry area. During the investigation, police also searched his computer and phone, and it was revealed that 2 weeks after the soldier's disappearance, Leland Days entered the search query human body dismemberment. Over time, Leland Days confessed to investigators that he gave the soldier a ride but denied any involvement in his death before finally admitting to the murder on March 29, 2018. There are also suspicions that Leland Days may be responsible for the unsolved murder of 3 people in the Alps when a British man, his wife, and his mother-in-law were killed in a car park in a wooded area in September 2012. Other cases in which Leland Days may be involved include the disappearance of Adrien Murel, a 24-year-old Belgian man who went missing near Lake Annecy in July, and Jean-Christophe Morin and Ahmed Hamad, who disappeared in 2011 and 2012, respectively. Leland Days' alleged connections to these murders led the police to start reviewing other cases of missing people in the region as they feared he might be a serial killer. The police investigated his possible involvement in at least 10 other crimes. While investigating other potential crimes, Leland Days' connection to the case of Estelle Mouzin came to light. Maellys' disappearance bore similarities to Estelle's case,
as the girls were about the same age and both vanished without a trace, with no witnesses to the abductions. Recognizing this similarity, Estelle's family requested to determine Leland Day's whereabouts at the time of their daughter's disappearance. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it turned out that he was serving in the military in the Marne department, 150 kilometers away from where Estelle disappeared. Thus, law enforcement had to dismiss him as a second prospective suspect in Estelle Mouzin's abduction case. Over the course of several years while the search for Estelle was ongoing, other potential leads were discovered, which ultimately led nowhere. For instance, a real shock for the girl's family was the appearance of a photo allegedly of Estelle, which was taken from a website containing indecent images of children. Her father confessed how upset he was by the appearance of such a photo, but it turned out not to be his daughter. The girl in the photo appeared older than Estelle, and the image was taken several years before her disappearance. The police had no new leads, and the chances of finding Estelle were diminishing before their eyes. But then thunder struck on January 24, 2020, when Monique Olivier, the former wife of Michel Fourniret, claimed that her ex-husband killed Estelle Mouzin. On March 6, 2020, her statements were confirmed by Michel Fourniret himself. For years, Michel Fourniret denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance. However, 16.5 years later, on November 27, 2019, Michel Fourniret, a serial killer and predator of minors who was already serving a life sentence, became the primary suspect once again. He was charged with abduction and forced confinement, which ended in death. On January 24, 2020, Monique Olivier confirmed to Judge Sabine Keris that it was indeed her who made the phone call from their home to Fourniret's son on January 9, 2003, the day of the girl's disappearance. Not stopping there, she continued to narrate that the girl represented the type of victim her husband was seeking, and she was not too young for him as psychologists once claimed. She admitted that a few days before the abduction, her husband had been driving around the region and returned one evening, announcing that he had spotted a beautiful little target, as he put it. Responding to questions from the investigating judge after his alibi collapsed due to his former wife's confession, Fourniret finally confirmed that he abducted and killed the girl. However, the elderly Fourniret claimed during the hearing that he suffers from memory loss and was not formally charged. "It is very likely, even very, very likely, that I was the author of that disappearance," Fourniret said, asserting that nothing clicked in his head when he was shown a picture of the girl. "Since I cannot say for sure that I am responsible for her disappearance, I call on you to consider me as guilty," he added. Fourniret, 78 years old according to media reports, is suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, experiencing moments of absence, but has generally understood everything, according to Didier Sabin, the lawyer of Estelle's father. To corroborate Fourniret's statements, Monique Olivier was questioned again, and she confirmed that her husband did indeed abduct and kill Estelle Mouzin. Although Fourniret confessed to the girl's murder, he refused or was unable to reveal the location where he hid her body. He only mentioned that she might be on the property of one of his houses in the Ardennes. Forensics began the grim search for the girl's remains on Monday, June 22, 2020. Experts sealed off Fourniret's former home in northern France, more than 200 kilometers from where Estelle was abducted on her way home from school. The police also cordoned off another former residence of Fourniret in Château de Sautou, where the remains of other victims of the killer, a 12-year-old girl and a 22-year-old woman, were found in 2004. Unfortunately, they did not find Estelle's body. "We can report some progress, but some doors have been closed forever, places we can now discard," said one of the lawyers representing the Mouzin family. Even before Fourniret's confession to Estelle's murder, the serial killer, nicknamed the Monster of the Ardennes, as well as the Virginity Hunter, had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His accomplice, Monique Olivier, also received a life sentence with the possibility of parole only after 28 years. On February 19, 2001, at the Battle Bridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous, and he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, Anne thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, thick, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children,
They were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control, and her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, found and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown, but it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4th, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had, so she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful Blom, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Baymer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3. Not knowing what to do with them, he sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police did their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence he knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night" in Vienna depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. 2 poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and 2 hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly 2 women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Sweeney is too dangerous to ever be released again.